And we are back at the FIDE World Blitz 2025 with another exciting matchup. Vladislav Artemiev, touted by the late Daniel Nodirbek as being world championship caliber, versus Nodirbek Abusattorov. He's currently maybe top 5 in the world, number 1 in Uzbekistan. More recently at the Grand Swiss, he shared that he believes Gukesh will probably not defend the world title. So he definitely has a lot to prove, but Nodirbek has already proved that he's got what it takes to also become the world champion, so let's see how he handles this game. Out of the opening, we have a Berlin defense, where black has been able to play the move pawn to d5. d5 is a typical move that allows black to liberate his position a little bit, but after playing the move pawn to d5 and the exchange of d for e pawn, it looks like black has been saddled with a weak pawn on e5, and so the rooks are definitely going to come to the e file, where they can attack the e5 pawn. I think at some point Nodirbek will develop his bishop to b2, where he'll try to activate it with the move pawn to c4, and that will allow white to add another attacker against the weak e5 pawn. I don't think it'll stay on the c1 h6 diagonal, just because there's a pawn stopping it from going to f4, and there's another pawn stopping it from going to g5, so it looks like it doesn't have much hope here. He starts by playing the move pawn to a3, nice stabilizing move, supporting the b4 pawn, and also allowing him in the future to move the c pawn without any regrets. So even though black has been able to get everything he wants out of the opening, I think white has a very, very pleasant position here, just because of this weak pawn on e5. And while Artemiev ponders on how he's going to continue in the position, I just want to remind you that if you're enjoying the content so far and you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. That would mean a lot. Now, Artemiev, he still has to develop his light squared bishop, as well as connect his rooks, so I can imagine the bishop might come to g4 at some point. Another common idea is that it can go to e6, where it challenges this bishop that's really strong on c4. Other than that, if black can maybe play the move pawn to e4 at some point, he could be looking pretty good, but it looks pretty difficult right now, considering that e4 is well protected by the rook on e1 and the knight on d2. So Artemiev decides to go for the move bishop to f5. This does support the e4 push. We would get rid of his weakness. The secondary idea behind this move is that it's stopping the bishop on c4 from moving. Previously, Nodirbek probably wanted to move that bishop off the square so he can put a pawn on c4, opening up his dark square bishop, but because the bishop was tied down to the defense of the d3 pawn, he has to start by moving the knight to e4, where it's now blocking the bishop on f5. It's also stopping the pawn from moving forward, so very logical move from Nodirbek. He's preparing to move the bishop back to b3, maybe to c2, and then he really wants to play this move pawn to c4, so that his dark squared bishop can participate in the game as well. Because right now, that bishop on b2 is kind of just like a big ugly pawn. We see an exchange of light squared bishops, and then the c4 move that we were talking about earlier opens up the dark squared bishop on b2. And so the pawn on e5, it's slowly starting to feel more and more pressure. The one downside that white maybe has in this position is that because the pawn has moved from c3 to c4 and there's no e pawn, maybe black can take advantage of the weak d4 square. But currently I don't really see that happening, just because there's not that many attackers looking at that square. There's only the knight on c6. Something that kind of makes sense would be for the dark squared bishop to move, probably back to f8, and just as I say it, Artemiev plays the move. The queen is now working in tandem with the knight on c6 to control the d4 square, and so if black is able to successfully plant their knight on d4, then they would kind of be in business. But also it's important for them to avoid being too hasty, because if they were to play knight d4 right now, and knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, well, the general advice is that you want a piece to occupy weak squares, not a pawn. So maybe that would be a lost advantage for black there. Queen to c2 is played by Nodirbek, and this is just supporting d3. This is moving out of the way so that the rooks are nice and connected. And I can definitely see white doubling up the rooks in the near future, like rook to e3, maybe rook to e2 is a little bit more accurate. Rook to e2 and rook to e1. And so Artemiev, he starts by taking on e4, which does help white double their rooks on the e file. That's probably the most natural plan. 4 pieces now attacking the pawn on e5. Only 3 defenders. So the other rook might come to e8. Another move that black could consider is to put the rook on d8, counter-attacking the weak d3 pawn. So white and black, it's a quite balanced position. 1 weakness on d3, 1 weakness on e5. Now white feels slightly more in control, and that's why Nodirbek plays the move rook to e3. He's not rushing with simplifying everything, because then he would lose his advantage completely. So he's just holding on. The rook's double on the e file for black. h3 is played, slowly improving the position. Now Artemiev plays the move f6. He is protecting the weakness on e5, but look at the Swiss cheese around the king. So many light squared weaknesses. b5 is played, attacking the knight. And now black has a really bad weakness on c7. The rooks now might swing over to the c file, and black could be in serious danger. One move I might consider for black is at some point the move pawn to c6. But after pawn takes c6, pawn takes c6, that would be a very, very strong passed pawn on the a file for white. And so that could be an advantage. Artemiev, he plays it. Logical move. Now if the knight were to take on c6, then there would just be a weakness on b7. So it's a tough position for black. Hard to play. And Nodirbek, he's considering what to do. Maybe he should throw in rook to c1 first. Very pleasant position for white, but he does have to think about this one weakness on d3. That's where black is going to try to focus a lot of his play. Nodirbek first starts by taking on c6, and then he plays d4. Very nice move, getting rid of his weakness, and taking advantage of the pin along the e file. The pawn cannot take because so many pieces will be looking at the rook on e6, and black will be losing material there. And now Nodirbek is actually going to be a pawn up after this. 4 pieces are looking at the pawn on e5. And also this rook on e6 is pinned to the king. The queen on b3 is doing a great job on this diagonal. So that's why he drops back to a2. He doesn't trade on b5. The queen is also supporting the passer on a3. A queen trade is offered, but Nodirbek should be very happy with the simplification, because he does have a 3-on-2 on the king side. And this a pawn is super far away. The king is not going to be able to go stop that pawn and then make it back to the defense of his king side. And so both sides are going to try to centralize their kings. White probably wants to bring his king to d4 or f4. That makes a lot of sense to me. And at some point, Nodirbek is going to make another pass pawn on the king side. Sometimes one advantage in the endgame might not be enough to win you the game. And so if Nodirbek is able to play on both sides of the board and make a passed pawn on the king side, then his winning chances will greatly increase. The bishop trade for black is unthinkable because the king and pawn endgame is losing. That's for sure. And so Artemiev, he's going to have to dodge around with his bishop, trying to avoid the bishop trade. But this allows the king to centralize on d4, and the pawn on d5 is very tender. They trade a pawn for c pawn, but black's king is just cut off on the queen side. White's king has successfully shouldered his way into the position. He's going to march behind the pawns and start by gobbling up on g6 and h5. After a trade of the pawns on the king side, Artemiev, he just decides to resign because his king is so far away from the action, and pretty soon white will make a new passed pawn. Very smooth victory by Nodirbek. Throughout the middle game, it felt like he was in control the whole time. In the opening, I think Artemiev, he was playing pretty well, but once he got low in time, things just didn't pan out very well for him. If you enjoyed, remember to leave a like, and also in the comments, maybe let me know which other players you'd like to see. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.